Have you ever found yourself staring at your phone, wondering if it's broken? Not because it won't turn on, but because it just hasn't rung all day or all week. You check the signal, you scroll through your recent calls, and there it is, your name, reaching out again. Their names, silent. And maybe you tell yourself, they're busy. Maybe you excuse it. They've got kids, careers, lives. But deep down, in that quiet part of you, there's a small ache, a question you don't dare ask aloud. When did I become the only one trying to stay connected? You never meant to be the one chasing. When they were young, they used to run to you eyes bright, arms open. You were their safe place. You were the one they couldn't wait to tell everything to. But slowly, the roles reversed. And now, every call, every visit, every invitation comes from you. And when you stop for a while, when you wait to see if they'll reach out first, the silence can feel unbearable. You begin to wonder, if I didn't call, would they ever? It's a hard place to be, not because you're weak, but because you love, because connection matters, because being remembered matters. But what if I told you that constantly reaching out, always being the one to check in, to initiate, to keep the ties alive, might actually be pushing them further away? Let me tell you about Hannah. Hannah is 67, soft-spoken, gracious, the kind of woman who remembers everyone's birthday. Her 3 adult children live in different cities, and for the last 10 years, she's made it her mission to stay close. She sends holiday cards, plans Zoom calls, offers to visit, but rarely gets the same energy in return. They love her. She knows that. But she started feeling like an afterthought. And when she stopped calling for a week, just to see what would happen, nothing did. She called me one evening, her voice trembling, and said, "I don't think they even noticed." I went quiet, and I asked her something simple. What would happen if you stopped trying to stay relevant in their lives and started making yourself radiant in your own? Because here's the truth we often miss. When you're always the one reaching out, people stop feeling the need to reach back. Not out of malice, but because your availability becomes assumed. Your presence becomes background noise, and slowly, they forget what your absence feels like. We teach people how to treat us every time you're the one who texts first, who asks how they're doing, who suggests a visit. You're reinforcing a pattern. I will always be the one who keeps this bond alive. But relationships, real ones, cannot breathe in one direction. So what did Hannah do? She took a step back, not in bitterness, but in bravery. She stopped initiating for a while, and instead, she started initiating something else. Her own life. She joined a walking group in her neighborhood. She started watercolor painting. She reconnected with an old friend from high school and started having lunch with her every Thursday. She turned her focus inward, not out of spite, but out of quiet power. At first, the silence from her children continued, and it hurt. But then, slowly, things shifted. Her daughter called one Saturday morning, just to say, "Hey mom, haven't heard from you this week, everything, okay?" Her son texted later that month to ask about a family recipe, and something flickered to life in Hannah that hadn't been there in years. Not the comfort of being contacted, but the confidence of being centered in her own life. You see, there's something magnetic about someone who no longer tries to prove their importance. When you stop showing up from a place of need and start moving from a place of peace, people feel it. They're drawn to it, not out of guilt, but out of curiosity, out of renewed respect. Jack, another friend of mine, is 73. He told me once that he felt like he was always knocking on his children's emotional doors, asking, waiting, hoping. But one day, after a long drive to visit his son, only to find him too busy to talk, Jack sat in his car and made a quiet decision. He would stop reaching out, not as a punishment, but as a way to see clearly. I realized, he told me, if I have to beg for their attention, it's not attention, it's obligation, and I don't want that. The first few weeks were hard. The silence rang louder than any rejection. But then, he filled that space with things he loved: gardening, reading on the porch with a cup of tea, helping a neighbor fix a fence. And one afternoon, his phone rang. It was his granddaughter, just calling to say hi. That call was different, not because it came first, but because it came freely. And maybe that's what this is about. Not getting your children or your friends or your family to chase you. Not flipping the roles so they feel what you feel. But simply reclaiming your energy. Reminding yourself that your worth is not measured by how many people need you, but by how deeply you are connected to your own life. Because here's the quiet truth. When you stop reaching from a place of fear of being forgotten, left out, unloved, and start standing in your fullness, people notice. They may not say it, but something stirs, something changes, not because you demanded it, but because you remembered who you are. There's a strange kind of exhaustion that comes from always being the one to hold the thread of a relationship. You tie the knots, you keep it from unraveling. You reach out again and again, hoping that maybe this time the effort will echo back. And when it doesn't, you start to wonder, is it you? Did you do something wrong? Are you expecting too much? But what if the answer isn't about what you're doing, but why? You see, when we've spent a lifetime nurturing others, raising children, tending marriages, caring for relatives, we learn to equate love with effort. That the more we give, the more valuable we are. That our worth lies in what we can do for others. Frank, a quiet man with a sharp wit and kind eyes, once told me, "I don't mind being the one to reach out. What hurts is feeling like no one notices when I stop." He wasn't bitter, he was tired. And under that tiredness was something deeper. Fear that if he didn't show up, he'd be forgotten. Frank's story isn't rare. It's written in the lives of so many who grew up in a generation that prized selflessness. You were taught not to make waves, not to speak up, to give without asking. And somewhere along the line, that turned into people-pleasing. It starts off with good intentions. You want to be kind, helpful, easy to be around, but then you start biting your tongue when something hurts. You downplay your needs. You say yes when you're exhausted. You answer every call, even when you're in the middle of something important to you. And before you know it, your time, your energy, your peace no longer feels like it belongs to you. That's what happened to Grace. Grace was the glue of her family. She organized the reunions. She remembered every detail about every grandchild. She sent care packages, made soup when someone was sick, called every Sunday to check in. But she noticed something. No one checked on her. Not because they didn't care, but because they had learned to expect her strength, her effort, her presence. She had trained them, unintentionally, to believe she would always be there, always reaching out, always available. So she stopped. At first, it felt unnatural. She said it felt like letting go of the steering wheel. But instead of crashing, something unexpected happened. Her son called, confused, and asked if she was okay. Her daughter asked if she'd forgotten about their usual Sunday call. Her granddaughter even showed up with flowers one afternoon, saying, "I missed you." Grace didn't stop because she was angry. She stopped because she realized something important. If she kept giving without boundaries, she'd disappear into her own kindness. And that's not love. That's erasure. So she began to say no. Softly, kindly, she started saying, "I'm not available that day," or "I'd love to talk, but can we schedule something later?" She set limits not to punish, but to protect her own peace. And slowly, the dynamic changed. Her relationships became more balanced. People started checking in without being prompted. Not always, not perfectly, but enough to remind her that her value wasn't tied to her effort. It was tied to her presence. That's the power of boundaries. Boundaries aren't walls. They're not harsh ultimatums. They're gentle reminders. I have needs. Two, I have limits. I am still a person, not a resource. Emily, another friend of mine, said something beautiful once. "I used to think saying no meant I was being selfish. Now I realize it means I'm being honest. Honest about what you can give. Honest about what you need. Honest about how you deserve to be treated. Because when you're always the one adjusting, always accommodating, always making space, you begin to vanish in the process. And the people around you don't necessarily mean to disrespect you, but they will follow your lead. If you act like your time isn't valuable, they won't treat it as valuable. If you act like your voice doesn't matter, they won't stop to listen. If you act like you'll always be the one to reach out, they'll wait for you to do it. But here's the quiet secret that lives at the heart of this journey. When you stop showing up out of fear and start showing up from a place of grounded self-respect, people respond differently. They don't always change overnight, but they begin to notice something has shifted. Your silence speaks volumes, not as punishment, but as presence. You stop calling just to be remembered, and instead allow yourself to be missed. You stop asking, "Why didn't they check in?" and start asking, "How can I care for myself in this moment?" You stop shrinking to make room for others and start expanding gently into your own joy. This is not about withdrawing. It's about redefining. You are not leaving your family behind. You are inviting them to meet you in a new space, a space where love flows in both directions, where you are not the sole keeper of connection, but a co-creator of it. And as you do, something beautiful begins to take shape. You feel lighter, not because people are finally calling more, but because you're no longer holding the weight of their absence as a measure of your worth. Your worth is not in their response. It is in your being. And when you begin to live from that truth, you become magnetic. Not because you're demanding to be seen, but because you've remembered that you always were. There's a gentle kind of power that rises when you stop reaching out to be chosen and start choosing yourself instead. At first, it doesn't feel like power. It feels like silence, like stillness, like absence. It feels like walking away from something you've spent years trying to hold together with both hands. But as the quiet stretches, something else takes its place: clarity. That's what happened with Margaret. For years, she called her son every Sunday afternoon, rain or shine. Whether she felt well or not, she made that call. Sometimes he picked up, sometimes he didn't. When he did, the conversation was brief, rushed, kind, but distracted. Still, she kept calling, because that's what mothers do, right? But one weekend, she paused. She asked herself a hard question. If I stopped calling, would he notice or would he feel relieved? That question hurt, not because she believed he didn't love her, but because she realized the connection had become one-sided, a routine of obligation, not a dance of love. So she didn't call that Sunday or the next. She didn't make a grand announcement. She didn't pull away in anger. She simply chose not to chase. And for a few weeks, the silence echoed. Her phone stayed still. Her heart ached. But in that stillness, Margaret began to rediscover pieces of herself she'd forgotten. She started writing again. She joined a local storytelling group. She made tea in the mornings and sat by the window, not waiting, not hoping, just being fully, quietly, beautifully present with herself. And then one afternoon, her son called. "Hi, Mom," he said. "I was just thinking about you. Haven't heard from you in a while. Is everything okay?" Something had shifted, not just in him, but in her, because this time, she didn't rush to fill the space with reassurances or apologies. She didn't pretend the silence hadn't happened. She simply said, "I'm doing well, just taking care of myself a little more lately." That's what it means to embody the change. You're no longer reaching out to remind others you exist. You're living in a way that makes your presence undeniable, and people sense it. Respect doesn't always come when you demand it, but it often arrives when you stop giving yourself away too easily. Ethan, a man in his late 60s, spent decades as the family peacemaker. He was the one who called to mend arguments, who organized get-togethers, who sent updates to keep distant cousins in touch. Everyone said they appreciated him, but when he stopped doing all the emotional labor, no one stepped in to carry it. The group chats went silent. Holidays grew quieter, and for a while, Ethan felt invisible. But then he started inviting people into his life differently. Not as the organizer, but as a person. He stopped asking, "When can we all meet?" and started saying, "I'll be at the park reading this Thursday if anyone wants to join me." He stopped hosting dinners and started going out for solo meals at his favorite cafe. And slowly, invitations began to return, not out of habit, but out of interest. When you stop forcing connection, you make space for authentic connection to grow. It's not about withdrawing in silence to punish others. It's about living so fully in your own light that others want to come closer, to see what changed. You become not someone they feel guilty about neglecting, but someone they feel inspired to reach out to. Because you're no longer waiting at the edge of their world. You've built your own. And something incredible happens when you do that. Your joy becomes visible again. You laugh more not because life got easier, but because you finally gave yourself permission to breathe. You take yourself on walks, on dates, on adventures you used to wait for others to invite you on. You read books that speak to you. You dance in the kitchen to music only you hear. You begin to feel alive again. And here's the most beautiful part. When you are full of your own life, you are easier to love. Not because you're trying harder, but because you're no longer clinging. You're no longer asking others to validate your worth. You've remembered that your worth was never lost. Sophie once said to me, "I spent years trying to get my children to see me. But the moment I saw myself clearly again, they started looking at me differently. They started asking her for advice again. Not because she offered it, but because she became someone who walked in wisdom, not worry." When you radiate contentment, it stirs something in others. It's not about playing hard to get. It's about being grounded in who you are, so that others are drawn to the peace you carry. And that's what changes everything. You're no longer the one who texts first, because you're afraid of silence. You text when you want to. You answer calls when you're free. You visit not out of duty, but because you're filled up and ready to share your joy. That's what makes people call you first, not guilt. Not manipulation, but the quiet magnetism of someone who no longer chases. You don't have to beg to be remembered. You only have to remember yourself, because the truth is, you were never meant to be the only one reaching out. Real connection lives in the space where both people lean in, not just out of habit, but out of care. And when you let go of the role you were never meant to hold forever, the caretaker, the planner, the peacekeeper, you make room for something deeper. To be loved, not for what you give, but for who you are. You don't need to be loud to be heard. You only need to stand firmly in your light. And when you do, they will notice. If you've stayed with me through all of this, through the ache of one-sided reaching, through the quiet courage it takes to step back, through the stories of people just like you rediscovering their light, then I want to say something very simple and very true. Thank you. Thank you for being here, for listening, not just with your ears, but with your heart. It takes strength to sit with uncomfortable truths. It takes even more strength to gently begin shifting the way you live, to protect your energy, and to open the door to peace instead of performance. I know what it's like to feel like you're fading from the lives of the ones you love, to feel like you're becoming a ghost in their world, present, but not seen, reaching, but not held. You begin to question everything, your choices, your role, your voice. But I want you to hear this now, clearly and without question. You are not invisible. Your presence matters. Your story matters. Your love matters. And just because others haven't always reflected that truth back to you, doesn't mean it's not true. This video wasn't about getting anyone to call you out of guilt. It wasn't about playing games. It was about something far more powerful. Returning to yourself. Returning to the quiet dignity that lives in your bones. Returning to the voice within you that doesn't need applause to feel worthy. Because once you make that return, once you start living from that place of fullness, instead of always trying to fill others, people notice. The phone does ring. Not always often. Not always perfectly. But it does. And even more importantly, you start showing up in your own life again. Not waiting. Not wondering. Living. And that's a kind of joy no one can give you, and no one can take away. If any part of this message felt like it was written for you, if you felt seen, or heard, or comforted in any way, I'd love to hear your story. Have you been the one always reaching out? What helped you step back, or breathe again, or feel whole? Share it in the comments below. Because someone else is reading, and they may need to know they're not alone. This isn't just a video. It's a space we're building where truth and tenderness are welcome, where we stop pretending and start healing, where growing older doesn't mean growing smaller. It means growing deeper, softer, braver. And if this message touched something inside you, I'd love for us to stay connected, not out of obligation, but out of shared understanding. Click subscribe if you'd like to walk this path with me. We'll keep having these conversations, quiet, honest, transformative. You don't need to call them to be remembered. You only need to remember yourself. And when you do, they just might call you first. Until then, Take gentle care of your spirit. You are deeply seen, you are richly loved, and you are never, ever alone.